Hello, 7th and 8th grade. Welcome back to history with Mr. E. Today we're going to talk about Reagan's foreign policy, 23.2. The Reagan Doctrine wanted to stop communism before it spread. Just like the Truman Doctrine, we would help nations that were being threatened by communism. Reagan wanted to stop communism before it spread. In Poland, he stood for the solidarity movement and helped the Poles, the nationalists in Poland, stand up to the Soviets. The communists tried to declare martial law, but Reagan backed solidarity and helped keep Poland free from communism. In Grenada, which is in the southern part of our hemisphere, Castro planned to take over Grenada. Castro was the communist ruler of Cuba, who was in line with the Russians. He wanted to use Grenada as a military base and invade the South American mainland and build an empire in South America. Reagan ended up having to send troops to Grenada in a show of force, and we fought there and send the Cubans right back to Cuba. He saved Grenada and pretty much all of South America because South America is mostly, unfortunately, a third world country because of, drugs and terrorists and all the backward nature of a lot of these people that are down there. Unfortunately, I'm not saying this because I dislike South America. I'm just saying that it's still behind compared to America. And he saved South America from falling to communism. Like Africa, another third world continent, had pretty much almost every nation in Africa fallen to communism over the years. Because third world countries are very, 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 very susceptible to communist ideals. Reagan had to send 50 military advisors to El Salvador to prevent a communist takeover. We were forced to build up our military and show strength when the Soviets shot down a passenger plane in South Korea. Not a military plane, a passenger plane, and killed 269 people, 60 of which were Americans. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan the year I was born, 1979, and the U.S. sent Afghanistan high-tech weapons. That's probably not a great idea, but we ended up helping Afghanistan to stay independent. We had to deal with Libya. Libya is an oil-rich country. Well, actually, they're just a giant desert that had some oil wells in it, but they're rich because of it. And their leader, Muammar al-Gaddafi, you can ask your parents about Gaddafi, he was a crazy lunatic, was training Muslim terrorists and sponsoring international terrorism throughout Libya and pushing it into the world. They bombed a U.S. military base in Germany. So the United States bombed the living daylights out of Libya, and Libya backed down. Gaddafi, if I remember correctly, was killed by his own people in the streets of Libya in the 2000s. But I'd have to look it up to verify the dates and information. One of the bad parts that happened in 1986, the Iran-Contra. Terrorists seized 6 Americans in Lebanon and held them hostage. Reagan sold arms to Iranians in return for help to get the hostages back. This was all arranged secretly by the CIA, and the sale of those hostages were used to train, and this is really complex, but to train Nicaraguan Contra freedom fighters who later became terrorists in and of themselves. So basically, to free American hostages, we sold arms to Iranians, and then we took the proceeds from selling those arms, and the CIA trained Nicaraguan freedom fighters who later became terrorists. And it was just a big mess. We tried very hard to have a treaty with Russia. The leader of Russia was now Mikhail Gorbachev. He was a bald-headed guy with a big port wine spot right there on his head. You should look him up. Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a reformer. He helped to break down a lot of our medium or intermediate range nuclear forces. To get rid of a lot of the nuclear bombs and missiles that were all over the world, put there by Russia, and America decommissioned a lot of their nuclear facilities in Europe and stuff, and it was really great. You see, at this time, the Soviet Union's economy was failing, and they just couldn't continue to build up their military time after time after time. And they just couldn't keep up with America. Communism was inefficient. It didn't work. The system was broken and it didn't work. There was no incentive to work hard under communism because there was no way to profit. We know that if we work hard, we'll gain from that hard work. All Russia had was pride in the fatherland or motherland or whatever you call it. They didn't have any real incentive to work hard or improve skills. Alcoholism in Russia is endemic. It's like a plague. By the end of January, a few years ago, I was looking at statistics. By the end of January, more Russians had died from alcohol-related problems than Americans die from alcohol-related problems in an entire year. That's how bad alcoholism is. Say you're in Russia, in Moscow in the winter, and your buddy just disappears. Nobody can find him. Well, guess what? When the snow melts, there's your buddy right outside your apartment building, holding a bottle of vodka in one hand and face down in the ground, dead, and he'd been under the snow for 2 months, and nobody knew it. Because, of course it snows a ton in Russia and freezes up, but also because alcoholism is a plague in Russia. People love their vodka more than Americans love their beer or whiskey. It is a terrible, terrible problem. The Soviets spent way too much time building up their military and couldn't provide for the basic needs of their people. They couldn't feed their people. They couldn't give them jobs. They couldn't give them clothes. They couldn't help them prosper. And of course, the Russians were aiding terrorist groups all through the Cold War. Reagan gave a speech in 1987 in West Berlin. Remember, East Berlin was surrounded by the Berlin Wall. Families had been separated for years and years because of this wall. The communists ruled in East Berlin. He stood, Reagan did, in a speech and gave an ultimatum. He said, "Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It was beautiful. I want you guys to go online to YouTube and look up that speech. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Reagan's great challenge to Russia. Reagan also had America had much better weapons. We had laser-guided missiles. We had the Strategic Defense Initiative, which brought weaponry into the space age. And Russia just couldn't hold on anymore. Gorbachev, like I said, was a reformer, and he took steps toward peace. To reduce Soviet weapon strength is number one. Number two is to free all the nations of Eastern Europe that they'd taken their liberty and freedom and push them to be part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics after World War II. They gave them all their independence back. And then they promised also to stop encouraging revolution and bloodshed. The U.S. worked hard for years to help these Eastern European nations rebuild. Soviet called their restructuring program Perestroika. 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 And they opened Russia to other countries because it had been closed for years in a policy called glasnost. And finally, the Soviet Union fell, and they left communism behind in some larger extent and became a capitalist nation. A lot of people still have communist leanings. Putin is communist for the most part, but capitalist in name only. Russia's still a mess, but they've made a lot of strides toward freedom for their people. And of course, all of Eastern Europe was freed from under Russian rule. Soviets continued to fund communist terrorists, but only on a smaller scale. Horrible. Reagan left a great legacy to the United States. A legacy of, number one, traditional values. Number two, less government regulation of private property. He broke down that bureaucracy. And number three, a return to patriotism and military strength. And of course, his greatest achievement, in my opinion, wasn't even for America, but it was for the world, where he helped to collapse the communism in the Soviet Union. Reagan may have been and may be the greatest president of my lifetime.